Hi, folks. Jason Heath here, Contrabass Conversations. And today is a bonus episode, which is something I almost never put out. But I thought that our past episode, Orchestra Confidential, warranted a little bit of context. And so that's what this episode is. When I was getting ready for that episode, Orchestra Confidential, John Grillo, who he and I are co-hosting that Orchestra Confidential episode, John encouraged me to listen to something we put out about 10 years ago called The State of the Orchestra. And what this episode was me chatting with John about my book that I just put out, Road Warrior Without an Expense Account, which is a chronicle, an analysis, and a look at life as an orchestral freelance player, or maybe we should say an orchestral freelance player in the mid-2000s, which is really what that is. Things have changed. Some have, some haven't for folks doing that kind of work, but that's like a snapshot in time of my particular experience going through that world and what I saw, especially in terms of traps of people getting sort of stuck in different points where maybe they don't want to be stuck. So that book, by the way, it's totally available for free if you want a copy. It's included with the app if you have the Contrabass Conversations app. If you don't have that, go to contrabassconversations.com/app and you can download it. And I have a link in the show notes for this. You can just get it emailed to you too. So either way, you can have a copy of the book. I'd love to have you read it. And if you have any thoughts, feel free to share. Although, this is why I'm giving this preamble to this episode, a lot has changed for me in the intervening decade. And it's so funny to go back and listen to something that you did a decade ago, because I feel like I've lived 3 lifetimes at this point from the Jason that's having this conversation. And in a way I have. I was at this funny crossroads when I was recording this with John. I'd been freelancing for years and years and years. I was sick of it. Didn't want to do it anymore. But I didn't know what to do. So I went back to school to be an orchestra director. And at the same time, I started my blog. I started the podcast. I've told this story a lot, so I'm going quickly with this. But this was recorded right at the moment where I was having a lot of success online. I was also actually had sort of weirdly leveled up my freelance career by trying to quit everything and not caring so much. It actually opened a lot of new doors for me, which is fascinating. And then I was just about to start what ended up being kind of a whole career, start, middle, and end in the orchestral teaching world. So I'm listening to this Jason from that period talk, and it just feels like I recognize that Jason. I recognize the speech patterns. I recognize the voice. I recognize all this and that. But I'm in such a different place mindset-wise than I was here. And I think the simplest way is this is a Jason that has very much a scarcity mindset in this episode, even though I use the term, and it's hilarious. I was listening and I heard myself say scarcity and abundance mindset. So I already knew what that meant, but this is total Jason Heath scarcity mindset. I've done a lot of thinking and reading and reflection, that sort of stuff, and I'm definitely way more in the abundance mindset or I try to be with most things in my life, professional and otherwise. So I'm arguing with the Jason in this episode as I'm listening. I'm no, it doesn't have to be like that. There are other things you could do, this and that, blah, blah, blah. So but I thought you'd appreciate listening to this. Problem, it's a good problem, I guess, but with a podcast like this, with all these episodes, is the whole vision of it. There's so much content that finding this one conversation, the odds are just so low you'd find this unless I specifically pointed it to you. So I thought republishing it with a little bit of context would be helpful. So yeah, enjoy this conversation between John Grillo and myself about freelancing in the mid-2000s, my book, my perspectives, and keep in mind that as you're listening, and as I was listening, I'm arguing with that Jason. So feel free to communicate with me if you want to about this subject, feedback@contrabassconversations.com, and enjoy this blast from the past, The State of the Orchestra with John Grillo.
Hello, welcome today. This is John Grillo, and I'm accompanied by Jason Heath. Jason, how you doing today?
I'm doing great. How are you, John?
Jason and I have done several podcasts for contrabassconversations.com, which is a weekly podcast of bass-related issues. And Jason is also the author of doublebassblog.org, and I have my own blog, which is classicalmusicnews.tv. But today we're going to sort of move beyond some of the things we talk about with bass and have a more general viewpoint of the orchestra business in general, which we're starting called the State of the Orchestra. And today we're going to talk about Jason's book. So Jason has recently came out with a book in the summer of 2008 that's called Road Warrior Without an Expense Account, Rethinking Music Performance for the 21st Century. And Jason, why don't you just tell me, what was your inspiration, your thoughts, and what was some of the process about coming up with your first book?
Sure. Well, this is a total outgrowth of my blog, the doublebassblog.org. This was originally a 10-part series that I wrote on the blog about the music business and my frustrations with my sort of what I consider peon existence in the music business as a classical music freelance road warrior. And I like the idea for the title. I don't know if I ever actually used that title in the blog prior to this series, but I've done so much driving over the years. It's funny because now these last couple of years I drive less than the average person, but for a while I drove about 50,000 miles a year. So I really was a road warrior. But all those expenses that you might assume that your company would cover as a freelance musician, you are the one doing all that cover, and you're covering everything. It's on your own dime. And so I wrote this just to kind of express what I saw as some of the real pitfalls of this profession, stuff that I've experienced and stuff that I see colleagues experience. I think it's a really slippery slope that people fall into, this world of freelancing. And if you're prepared for it and you go into it knowing what you're getting into, that's one thing. But I think a lot of people, it's just completely haphazard. They land in it, and then 1, 2, 3 years later, they're looking at their lives and they're realizing, why have I spent $200,000 on education and I make $7,000 a year and I live with my mom? So that's kind of in a nutshell why I wrote it. I just wanted to get out my personal perspective about this business and some trends that I see happening.
Well, what's interesting, is you have chapter 1, realities of, working as a professional musician. And, I read through this book this summer, and, what's really interesting is really how someone, just gets involved in music in the first place, Mm-hmm. I mean, most career, for the most, one of my favorite quotes, I was at I've heard many people say this, but I was at a Kiri Takanawa gave a master class when I was at Manhattan School of Music, and that was the first time I heard that, when she said, you don't choose music, music chooses you. And in so many ways, it's kind of true because, you start playing music when you're a younger kid and you have all this young success at it. And then, you don't really know, what sort of the future abounds for you in so many ways. But why don't you tell us a little bit about, how many different places you played and, you went to several different cars and all that. Because you were actually making a decent, interesting because the other thing I think what you finally did is you just sort of made sort of a personal balance sheet. Like you just said, okay, what's my income, what are my expenses? Mm-hmm. And why don't you talk a little bit about what you came up with that?
Sure. Well, it all boils down to this covering your own expenses thing as a self-employed person. Because if you look at the numbers kind of on a surface level, it can look like you're making pretty decent money. I mean, in some ways, I was making a decent living doing all these different jobs. But then once you start to figure out the real expenses, it starts to look a lot bleaker. And the biggest one for most people these days that are not in a full-time orchestral position in the classical music world, the biggest thing is driving. It's just and even though gas prices right now, as of February 2009, they've gone down somewhat. They're about $2 a gallon instead of $4.50 a gallon. Even at that rate, even at that cost, gas, mileage, tolls, parking, car repairs, all those things, they are this unbelievable resource sink. And you'd be amazed when you really sit down and figure out how much money you're spending on just getting to the darn places, how much that's affecting your bottom line. You can take someone who looks like they're making maybe $70,000 a year, but in reality, after you figure out those expenses, they're really making more like 20. I mean, that seems astronomical, but it's true. Yet there is so little left for the typical freelance musician. Even if you live like a pauper and you bring all your own food and you try to pare down and carpool as much as you can, it's trying to get around to these different places. Just that right there is just an enormous and unexpected drawback to doing this kind of work.
Well, what's interesting is that, in most music schools, I've heard, so many people I know is that this issue is just not addressed at all. Mm-hmm. So, you have so many musicians, you sort of graduate from college and masters and stuff, and then you sort of hit with a question, okay, so what now? Mm-hmm. But, another interesting thing, what I like in your first chapter is, why don't you talk a little bit about that chart you have, talking about the Chicago double bass scene? Because I think the numbers are what, and we don't want to, music is a great profession. We both love playing music, and it has, certain challenges in it. So we definitely want to keep this conversation sort of balanced in a way. Mm-hmm. So just for the listeners, so they just don't think we're just, talking sort of doom and gloom here.
Yeah.
But even though it is a very challenging profession, and it's really sort of, we're really talking economics here more than anything else. So why don't you talk about that chart you have about Metropolitan Chicago classical double bass employment statistics? Very interesting.
Sure, yeah, absolutely. So we've got about 9 million people in Metro Chicago. In this area, 9 million people, and that's bigger than many countries, you have 15 full-time double bass positions. 15 out of 9 million people. So that breaks down to being one job for every 600,000 people. And if you average out the openings that have happened over the last few decades, it averages out to one vacancy every 5 years. So if you are going to music school and you're wanting to get, this is a bleak way to look at it, but I think it's a useful way to look at it. If you are going to music school, you have odds that are, you're more likely to become mayor of, let's say, Milwaukee, Wisconsin, than to get a full-time double bass position in Chicago. You have one shot every 5 years it averages out to, and you're going to be competing against hundreds and hundreds of people for that one shot. So, and that's just so different than other careers. And I think that that's just something that you have to wrap your brain around. It's really much more like being trying to become a Hollywood actor. It's much more like that than trying to become a lawyer or a doctor or a carpenter or anything. It's so astronomically difficult to get these jobs, and you can't manufacture these jobs. There's going to be an opening when there's an opening. That's it. You have no influence in that unless you want to go out and start picking people off, then I guess maybe you could get a job that way. But really, you're at the mercy of the external factors, and that makes you helpless in a way, and it's unless you end up freelancing or just being very, very lucky. Even with everything in your favor, your odds are just so low of getting one of these jobs. They're in the single percentile, so it's very, very challenging, and it's something to give some thought to. I mean, people go into music not to make a lot of money. That's not the reason that people generally go into music, unless you're in rap, maybe, but generally people go into music for other reasons. But still, I mean, you have to make a living. And once you're in music school, if you go to that, you start to get, if you look at a negative way to put it would be you start to get duped into thinking that there are jobs, because this isn't brought up really. Not really. How incredibly challenging it is. It's more like when you get a job, when you do this, well, guess what? For most people, there is no when you get a job, there's no job to get. So you're out there and you end up doing the kind of work that I wrote about in my book. So,
well, and I think they call that contrition, right? I think that's sort of a business terminology. So, a job comes open when someone retires or they just get sick or they pass away, some sort of really extending circumstance that comes along. But, and it's interesting because I think that's one thing that you're reacting against, and I have a lot of musician friends that say the same thing, is that to me it basically sort of boils down to what just basically the expectations are when you're in school. Because I have, people in the other arts, like you said, it's very much like acting. I mean, you go to acting school, they just know that their life is going to be, a little bit more of a struggle. They have to just, do whatever they can to make, ends meet and, different painting people. Mm-hmm. So to me, in a lot of ways, it's just a general expectation. And things are really, they're starting to kind of break down a little bit because I think, music schools, I don't know if they're being forced to. I mean, they still have a long way to go. But at least, there's starting to be a little bit more discussion. I guess even just more within the industry than the schools about, you have these conservatories. They're not connected to any sort of universities, Mm-hmm. I mean, I was at Manhattan School of Music. They had one computer, and this was in the middle of the whole tech boom. So, which is interesting. And I think what was the one website we had on a couple other our blog posts? It was I think it was orchestrafacts.org. Which was that had I think it was about 10,000 people graduated with music degrees every year, and with less than 100 positions per year.
Yep.
So, which is kind of interesting. Now, let's talk a little bit about number 2, because, like we said, this podcast series that we're starting here, State of the Orchestra, is our intention is to really just bring up all these extenuating issues that I know we talk about these with our colleagues just all the time, but there really is no sort of channel or forum for this. So what I like is in chapter 2 is that it's called The Rise and Fall of the Full-Time Orchestra. Why don't you talk about that a little bit, and then because this is really where all this sort of comes from, I think.
Yeah,
in America, I should say, the rise of the full-time orchestra, fall of the full-time orchestra in America. So.
Right, that really should be the subtitle for that one, because this is focused on what happened in the U.S. with full-time orchestras. So if you go back and before the 20th century, you realize that there were no full-time orchestras. That was a 20th century invention, and I think of it as a 20th century invention because it started to really break down at the end of the 20th century, and we still have this system in place, but we aren't gaining more orchestras right now. We're losing orchestras. They're either the jobs are remaining or they're disappearing. They're not increasing, and we're in the middle of a recession right now, so that's not going to help. But even during boom times, orchestras are not being created right now. They're only disappearing. They're either maintaining or disappearing. So in the 1960s, prior to the 1960s, everybody was a freelancer, basically. If you were in classical music, you pulled from many different sources to get to create a career. In the 1960s, corporate sponsorship started to happen. A lot of philanthropic giving started to happen to orchestras, and they started to really get built up, and they became these large not-for-profit organizations with all these employees, these musicians. People started to get on salary. They started to have collective bargaining agreements where they hammered out 52-week seasons, and people started to make a living just doing that. I mean, the Chicago Symphony used to mow lawns, members of the Chicago Symphony in the 1940s and 50s. Now, by the end of the 1960s, this was it. That was their job. And now this has really started to erode in the last few decades. It started to happen in the late 80s. It happened again, and now it's starting to happen again. But even during what you think of as prosperous economic times, orchestras are just disappearing all the time. A few that have happened recently, like the Tulsa Philharmonic, the San Jose Symphony, the Florida Philharmonic, and the Columbus Symphony have all disappeared. And what happens is these orchestras disappear, and they don't come back. They don't come back as full-time orchestras. That really doesn't happen. So along with these orchestras getting built up in the 60s, people started to attend music school in record numbers too. So you not only had positions being created, full-time positions. Well, actually, for a lot of people, this was their community orchestra that all of a sudden in the span of 5 years became a full-time job for them. That was just something they did along with many other things. All of a sudden they have a job, which is great. But now you also had all this just massive rise in music school attendance. So you have many more positions by, let's say, the 1970s, but you also have a lot of people flooding the market, and that continued to happen. In fact, we're graduating more music majors than we ever have now, and we're losing positions every year. So that's a little bit about what that model is. So if you go back in time, you realize that full-time orchestra is really just a few decades that has been a conventional job in the music world. And unfortunately, depending on your perspective, fortunately or unfortunately, these jobs are disappearing. And so that's going to be a real challenge for people going ahead.
But what's interesting, I think what was part of this is also coming out of World War II. That was really, so that's sort of that big boom in general in the United States in the 50s and 60s with the Ford Foundation. These big foundations, I think the World War II really sort of made America sort of, look at our fabric, and, it was war with Europe and stuff like that. So, and it was interesting because I remember I was playing an opera once with a very, senior bass player, real sweet guy. He was probably in his 80s or so, and he's played in a major orchestra for about 65 years or so. And I remember when I asked him the question, I said, "Well, what was it like?" I mean, he started playing. I think it was the 30s or something. I asked him, "So, what kind of jobs were around?" He said, "No, there weren't any jobs." And he said at his first audition, he went. I think there were like 2 or 3 bass players, and like one guy didn't even have a bow, the kind of country bass players. So, now sometimes we have auditions, there's 400 or 500 people, from a specific spot. So that's very interesting. So it's important to mention that because, we have these, I think because what you're basically saying also in this chapter is that that's sort of the model that students look at. So if you go to music school, someday, there's always still a chance that you'll play in New York Philharmonic, Chicago Symphony. So, so is that what you were trying to kind of? I think that was kind of one of the points you were trying to make, right? Or music schools rose around that, then, right?
Exactly. And there is a chance, but it's becoming. There was a reasonable expectation for a while that you would get a job. In fact, if you went to music school in the late 1960s or into the 1970s. And you were a competent player, the odds were pretty high that you would get a job. And that started to change in the 1980s and has continued to where now it's winning in auditions like winning the lottery in many ways. And a lot of the rest of the book is about how that really affects the young music school graduate. If you're and to take one of these auditions is a significant investment in time and money. And many people will never get a job, and they'll take 2 or 3 dozen auditions. So that plus and I talk about this later in the book too, the radical increase in cost of education. You take those 2 factors, the how much tuition has risen over the last 10, 15 years, and then how astronomically difficult it is to get a job. And you're really putting people into a difficult, dangerous position that can affect them for the rest of their lives. I mean, it's one thing if you decide to become an actor and you study on your own and you do this and you work at it and it doesn't work out. That's one thing. You've worked at it and it hasn't worked out. If you go and you spend $250,000 on these expensive degrees, expecting to get a job, and that's a pretty common dollar amount these days for the degree. And then you additionally spend $1,000 to $2,000 a pop to take all these auditions, and you take 36 of them. And you're not working during that time, all of a sudden you're racking up medical school debt. And even if you were to land one of these jobs, except for the top few orchestras, you're making like telemarketer money a lot of the time. I mean, it's pretty low. I have colleagues that were delighted to win a job in let's say the symphony that pays $12,000 or $13,000 a year. They were overjoyed, but they paid instrument insurance. So, I mean, right. It's just it's the height of insanity to me. And I mean, it's just kind of sad that this is where we're at, to me.
Well, I think it's also it's been a changing marketplace as far as all the different, like I think when you said, so before the full-time orchestra, I think in each specific city there were probably just way more, jobs, theater jobs, smaller chamber orchestra jobs than we have today. I think that's why the driving has become such a big thing.
I agree, definitely.
I mean, don't you know some people that they drive 3 hours one way for rehearsal, 3 hours back?
Oh, I think that is becoming common. People don't even blink an eye at that. And if you think about that, 3 hours each way. So we're talking 6 hours of commuting. And think about how much you're spending on gas. Think about your time. And then the wage that you get is just so low for there's an unfortunate inverse ratio to distance traveled versus pay for a job. Generally, if you live in a major metro area anyway, the higher the pay, the less you have to drive. So the farther you're having to go for a gig, generally, the less it's going to pay. So the people who are driving 3 hours, and that's many people, they're maybe going to take home somewhere between $75 and $100. Maybe more like $75 for that. So let's just say you're making $75 and you're commuting 6 hours, and then you've got a 2.5 hour rehearsal in there. So that's 8.5 hours total time commitment for $75. That right there is not very good. But then if we factor out of the mileage, the gas, all those costs, you could do better doing anything. I mean, you could beg on the street corner and probably do better. So it's. Unfortunately.
Well, what was your biggest year? How many orchestras were you playing? What was the biggest year of how many orchestras you were playing?
It's pretty common that I would play in maybe 20 orchestras. So
in one season you would play with 20 different orchestras?
Oh yeah, definitely. Come tax time, the 1099 forms and the W-2 forms, you'd be amazed at the stack of these things. I mean, we're talking at least, frequently like a couple dozen orchestras. Even now, when I'm mostly out of this work, I still get a dozen at least W-2s and 1099s from performing organizations.
So you would have 20 different orchestras that you're playing with, and then you would also have a big load of students, right?
Right. Yeah, and I talk about that to an extent in the book too. I would play with maybe 20 orchestras, and then I for a while I taught 40 bass students on top of that. So that was to say that was a challenge is an understatement, because that's 7 days a week of working. I would teach Sunday morning. I would teach Sunday night. I would teach Saturday morning. I'd teach every weeknight. I would teach 7 days a week, and I'd usually play maybe 5 days a week at least. So you're working 7 days a week then, and people might think, well, you're working doing what you love. Well, you start to realize that when you have to say yes to everything, the sheen comes off pretty quickly on that kind of work. So it quickly becomes a job, just like working at a bank is a job or just anything. And I think that's really, I think people get really disillusioned with this kind of lifestyle.
Well, I think it's for most people. I think it's the travel that's the biggest weight. I mean, if they were doing everything they were doing, and if it was in one city, I think it would be a totally different situation. So.
Oh yeah.
Now, Jason, another thing I want to touch on here is you've written a lot about this on your blog, and it's actually gotten a lot of comments from people outside of the music business talking about the pitfalls of adjunct teaching. So why don't you talk about that a little bit?
Right. Okay. Yeah, and that's interesting, because that was actually that was one of the first things I wrote about on the blog, where it was just being an adjunct instructor at a university. That was something that I continue to do that, but it kind of falls into the same category as freelancing. Like adjunct teachers are to the academic world what freelance musicians are to the full-time orchestral world. You're these sort of like other beings that are sort of floating around kind of vaguely in the same career, but not really in the same career. And the numbers break down, at least for what I was doing, which was teaching studio based. So I was teaching on I was paid per student by the university. So I was a university employee, but I got paid depending on how many students I had. And I've written about, I didn't write so much in the book, but I've written on the blog about sort of the pitfalls of that. But you start to break down those numbers too. And this is something that if you do with freelance playing too is equally depressing. You take, maybe you were making $35, $40 an hour teaching these students. But from a university, you're generally not being paid mileage or any sort of compensation like that. The university I taught at was 93 miles each way. So I'd figure out the block of time. I would usually spend 15 hours total that day for that job. And when you really break it down, and then sometimes I have to make extra trips to the school, not just for my students, for a faculty activity or something. And it gets down to like the $3 or $4 an hour range. So
Jason, was that coming out lower than traveling to play with a regional orchestra then?
Actually, it was. Actually, that's probably even lower. So,
but this is an issue in just academia in general, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of these issues spill out over, and that's part of why I find them interesting. And I think they might be interesting to people who are not just I think that they have a larger effect than just, I'm talking about freelance music, but people, this is something that adjunct employees at universities face all the time. This is something that self-employed people face all the time. Especially when you're in this sort of category of you're self-employed, but you're not able to control your own rates. You're working for other people, but you're just cobbling all this together. It's very different than owning your own business and being self-employed. This is sort of this third category of it's like quasi self-employment, quasi employee status. And I think that's the thing that's really tough with freelancing. If you really were 100% self-employed, you'd actually have much more control, and you'd be able to control rates and have more control over your schedule and where you took. But what you really are as a freelancer is you're a part-time employee of 20, 25, 30 different organizations, and you have to. Each one of these organizations has all their own rules regarding your employment. And I talk about this in the book. You have to juggle all these sets of rules. And anybody who's tried to juggle even a couple of different organizations realize that conflicts start to arise. And I get into this a lot in the book. But your life as a freelance musician quickly becomes trying to find a way that will alienate the fewest number of people and trying to take work that you need to take or want to take without putting yourself into a really unfortunate situation. And so it gets down to the lack of control thing again. It's just that I think that ultimately is, in addition to the low pay, is the most frustrating thing about being a freelance musician is just the lack of control.
Well, in chapter 5 too, you talk about the vicious cycle. It says, subtitle is inherent limitations in freelance employment options. Mm-hmm. Because it seems to me like you're the whole sort of theme here is this cycle of sort of getting, it's our choice to be musicians, obviously, but then we live within this business and get caught up in this cycle. What are sort of in general the biggest limitations as far as, looking forward to someone's career? I mean, we talked about some specifics here, but what do you think are the general either pitfalls or dangers of getting involved in this?
Well, the toughest thing, and in this chapter 5, I talk about this. The toughest issue is that there's work you are. What tends to happen for people is that you're offered sort of okay work on a more regular basis, and then you're also offered really excellent work, really artistically satisfying work, and that's why you got into this, is to be an artist. you're an artist. You want to do something that's artistically satisfying. You're offered that work sporadically, and then taking that work burns your bridges or reduces the likelihood that you'll be hired back by the more consistent but less fulfilling work. So what happens to people is frequently one of two things. Either you settle into a pattern of, let's say, mediocrity in the type of work you do, consistently okay, or you take those opportunities, those wonderful opportunities that, like playing with a major orchestra, going on tour with an ensemble, but that takes you out of the more active scene. So you all of a sudden, and then when that kind of work quits calling you, and it seems like, unfortunately, they almost always quit calling you after a certain while, because when you're getting called by a top-tier organization to work for them and you're not a member, well, there's probably a reason why they're calling you. It's because one of their members is indisposed or they're searching for somebody new. You're probably not going to have that opportunity forever. If you had it forever, you'd be a member of that group. Then you go back to that scene you were in, and you find that all these other people, all these other hungry, 9,900 other people that graduated that 1 year from college, they've all moved into your old work. So all of a sudden you've actually moved down in the tier. Now, instead of playing with the whatever orchestra, you're now playing with a community orchestra. Things have gotten more difficult for you. So the toughest thing about freelancing is it's not static. It's always changing, and any move you make to do something a little more interesting or satisfying generally ends up pulling you out of other work. And then if you need to settle back into that, it's a model of scarcity rather than abundance. It really is, like, for this kind of work, classical orchestral playing, that kind of work, there is only so much to go around. Unless you get into stuff that I talk later on in the book, creating your own work. But when you leave that scene, someone else takes your spot, and then that's it. It's just like the full-time world. So that is a real challenge. It's just stagnation. You get stuck because you either can't move on, you can't move to a better spot, or the better spot quits calling you, or you do move on and then you get settled down into a lower gig circle, and it's a real challenge.
It's a lot like athletics too. I think that's one of the best parallels. You have football, you have baseball, you have the minor leagues. There's thousands and thousands and thousands of people.
Yep. Yeah, absolutely.
That are in it, and there's only a certain amount of professional teams, and then that's it. So, it's just interesting because it seems like this would be talked about more, but
yeah,
and that leads to the next thing. So obviously, then you have towards the end, I think a big thing for you is this is sort of a two-pronged question here. Is that you always have burnout with your sort of famous picture of your hands on your head. But
yeah.
Before I talk to that, one of the things that fascinates me about this book is that and I really want you to explain this in more detail, is that the less you drove to play, the sort of the less you played, the less you did adjunct teaching, the more money you had. So explain that somehow.
Yeah, and that's a bizarre thing, and I know I'm not the only one who's experienced this.
How does that make sense? So if you're working your butt off, you're driving, you're working as hard as you can and teaching these adjunct positions, as hard as you can, all day, every day, mm-hmm. thousands of miles. All right, so explain it.
Well, there's only, it comes down to simple math. It costs X amount of money to do things, real hard currency, and you're paid X amount of money, and that amount, or Y amount of money, that money you're paid is, even though it doesn't seem like it's less, it's actually less than what you're spending. And I have found that to be the case time and time again. Because filling up gas tanks, you got to eat, you got all these things you have to. Parking, I go play in downtown Chicago, and I'll frequently spend $20, $25, $30 for parking.
Basically, since those expenses aren't reimbursed, hence the title Without an Expense Account.
Yep. It doesn't take too much before you actually are losing money working. And that is, but because of things like credit cards, because of just this whole cycle of you're spending the money first, you're paid later. It can be very, and then also as a musician, you tend to have all this churning going on in your bank account. You have so many employers, you have so many different checks, and something comes in and something doesn't, and something doesn't take out any taxes, and something takes out all the tax, and so it's bookkeeping becomes a nightmare. And it's very hard to track that expenses versus income. And what I found anyway is that as I play less, I actually have more money in my bank account. I actually am, at the end of the month, I have more money. And there are several reasons for that. So one reason that, and I have thought a lot about this, one thing that's happened is I quit doing all this adjunct teaching. So I started doing more private teaching. And that's all profit for me because I don't have any commuting expenses. And I'm paid directly by the student. So instead of getting paid through a university, and also my rate is higher than what I was making. So I don't have all those hours of commuting, and I just have that. So that's one thing, is like my per hour income went radically up when I stopped doing all that adjunct teaching. And then in terms of gigs, what I've done is I've really pared down. So the only work I do now is the work is what I consider the best work. And that work, it pays more and it's close to town. The farthest away I drive these days is Elgin, Illinois, which is about 35 miles from here. Everything else I do is within, just a few miles. So I've essentially zeroed out that my commuting costs. And if you think about it, if you were driving 50,000 miles a year, and then you go down to driving about 8,000 miles a year, that's 42,000 miles. And if you just take that, not forget about the hours and forget about what you could be doing with all that other time while you're in the car, that's a significant chunk of change right there, just from the costs associated with that. So not driving, staying at home, doing better work has all contributed to just, I have more money at the end of the month. And I don't know if that would happen for everybody, because I'm sort of lucky in a way, because I'm on a lot of higher quality lists for work. So I get offered a lot of good work. If you didn't have that, that might not be the case for everybody, but it sure was for me.
Well, what would be the difference? Do you think it would have been different if you learned more about this? Like, say you were the junior in college that picks up your book and reads through it. How do you think that would have changed your experience? Do you think you would have been more prepared for this, or
yeah?
Do you think you would have taken different channels, or?
I don't know if I would have done anything that differently, except maybe practice even more. Because the thing is, and one thing I try to make clear in the book, but I think is really important, is that I'm not necessarily trying to change anybody's mind with this or advocate any particular position except awareness. I think you should go for it. If that's what's driving you, I think you should do it. I have students right now that are going to be going to music school, and they're going to be going after this. And I've had them read all my stuff so they know my particular experience, but that doesn't mean it's going to be their experience. So I'm actually very optimistic in a way, because I really think, and I talk about this at the end of the book, that this will sort itself out, because there are too many people that love this art form and that are just so passionate about it for it to just disappear. I think that, and I find it frustrating that so many people are out there spending so much energy and so much of their income and getting themselves into such debt for these orchestra positions. But I'm really optimistic that there is so much passion for this. And I think that where there's that amount of passion, this situation there will be some sort of resolution here. Things are going to change. But I don't think it means that there are going to be more orchestra positions. I don't think that it means that your odds of getting an orchestra job are going to increase. So I just wanted to let people know what my experience has been like out there and what I see happening. And you just have to, it's your job to just take away from that what you can. I just want you, my intent, I guess, is if this would cause someone to think for a couple of hours, just seriously about the odds of doing this kind of work and just what it means to do this kind of work, and just to then file that away in the back of their mind, and as their career starts to progress, if they start to feel themselves going down that path and they don't want to go down that path, take action. If you do want to go down that path, and this path is great for a lot of people, it's not great if you're a single person trying to generate your income solely on this kind of work. I don't think it's very good. If you have a spouse or significant other that has a full-time job, all of a sudden this changes a lot. If you can be selective about the kind of work you do, it's a great part-time it's a great part-time profession, and it's a lousy full-time profession. Freelance music. That's what I think. Right now, the state of affairs, where it stands.
And isn't your book being read at some different music schools that you say? There was a couple people that were recommending it to their classes.
Yep. People have been getting some interest, and then I'm hoping that to spread the word a little bit more about this. It's the sort of thing I just like to think of it as just food for thought before you head out there.
What has been the reaction? Because I'm sure. What's the sort of devil's advocate to this? I could see a lot of people.
Yeah, the reaction's been good. It's sort of like like, wow, this is depressing, but valuable. And it's sort of funny because I'm actually not I'm actually a really optimistic guy. And if you look at my blog, most of the stuff is actually really positive on there. So it's sort of funny that there are a lot of negative things I'm expressing in this book. I'm just trying to be honest in this book. And so the reaction has been that sort of surprise that it really is this hard, and just positive reactions. I'm just trying to get people thinking with this stuff.
It seems to me too that it's a lot of time. I guess it's a lot of time and travel with not enough compensation, basically. I mean, to kind of boil it down.
I think that's what it comes down to. Yeah, absolutely. And I think you just you can take control if you're smart about it. There are things you can do to better your position in this career, and you really can. I mean, you can generate your own work. You can. I've actually, now that I've dialed down the amount of work that I do in terms of freelancing, I'm still 100% musician. I'm doing stuff all the time in the world of music, but I'm doing a lot of stuff online now. I'm trying to stay on the front edge of things, and I'm trying to evolve every day. I'm actually having more fun than I ever did. So you have to sort of be flexible with your notion of what it is to be a musician and a creative person. I feel like I am able to be more creative than I ever have been in what I do now, and I actually do better financially now than I ever did, and I'm still playing a lot and I'm still teaching a lot. I've just sort of tried to find my own niche, and my way is not going to be the way that works for everybody, but I think if you just don't accept what's given to you with these kinds of freelance jobs. Be flexible and be creative, and try to find opportunities and try to start opportunities too. You really can generate your own work, and that ultimately becomes the best kind of work, because most of the work you do as a freelancer is the result of somebody having an idea and saying, I want to start this, I want to do this. And if you can do that yourself, I think that there's huge potential there. I think that the potential for creating a scene and bringing back some vitality to this art form exists. I think it's huge. I think there are too many people out there for it not to happen. But we've got to quit banging our heads against the wall for these jobs that you have like a 3 to 4% chance of getting, and take all that energy and go out and start something new.
Well, I'm looking at the front of the book here. You also have, the subtitle, Rethinking Music for the 21st Century Musician. I don't know, how would you even define, what is the 21st Century Musician, you think?
Well, I think we're finding that out. I think it's not going to be, it's going to be less and less of people with cushy orchestra jobs, I think it's gonna be more guys like me. I think that's why I think it's moving back to a model that we saw in the 19th century. I think that this full-time orchestra model is kind of an anomaly, and I don't see it coming back, really.
Well, you know what I think you mean a lot by this, that you're the rise and fall of the full time. I think, is that, we sort of come after that sort of major growth period. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Definitely.
So it's at least the same or less, which is interesting.
Yeah.
So. Well, overall too, I mean, if music was, we're not just sort of a European based, culture country anymore, really. So.
Yeah. Yeah.
I mean, I think World War II had so much to do with that too. All the artists, they emigrated to the U.S. and all these different cultures. So the Italian culture had the opera. The Germans with the symphony, and the Russian Jews. You have New York and Brooklyn, the Lower East Side. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
A little bit closer connection to this sort of history of music. Where now, I mean. If America's the melting pot, what is American music? I mean, it's
exactly.
There's so many different ways to define that.
Yeah.
So, see a lot more people doing a lot of cross, sort of cross streaming different music styles. I mean, that's really been lacking a lot in the past. I mean, we've sort of been just stuck to this certain canon of material, certain method of presentation.
Mm-hmm. Definitely.
I mean, but I think there's also a real just lack of leadership too. I mean, where's the leadership on all this? It's hard because it's traditional. It's a very traditional art form, classical music. So people try different things out. It seems like it works, but then they get a lot of do you know what I mean? Like,
exactly.
Or some orchestras try to, because we wear tuxes. So I mean, who else wears tuxes? I mean, I go in and out with that. So.
Yep. That's true.
I mean, I'm sure you've had the moment you're eating lunch before a concert, and it's just nobody knows why you have a tux on. The only thing they can think is that it's a wedding of some sort.
Yep. Exactly. It looks like you're going to a wedding or you're a waiter. So one of those two. So in fact, I walked into a bar last summer. And I was wearing my tux, and the bartender came up to me and she said, "Oh man, I hate it when my boss makes me wear one of those. Doesn't that suck? Where do you work?" And I was like, "Oh, musician." And, it's like she's like, "Oh yeah, I was a waiter for this and this." And so it's like waiters and musicians. We have a lot more in common than you might realize.
So how about the car? How is just your car expensive? I mean, just the basic, buying a new one, tires, oil changes. How did that work into this whole mix when you were in 20 orchestras in multiple states and all that?
Yeah, I mean that's a challenge. When you drive 4 times more than a normal person, you burn through a car 4 times faster. So one of the problems for me at least was always, it's like my life was always on the verge of meltdown. So it's like everything was an emergency with the car. So I never really had the luxury. When you're driving that far, it's really dangerous to not have a car that's functioning well. So I was if there's something wrong with the brakes, get it. Yeah, I would take it in and get it taken care of if there was something wrong with anything. So I think just all those car expenses are just so huge. And I don't think that's something that music majors necessarily realize they're going to be thinking about that much, is like the state of their vehicle. But that's like, it becomes one of the more overriding concerns in this profession.
Well, Jason, what are some of don't you have some other books coming up in the pipeline?
Yeah, I've got 2 more things I'm working on. One is a complete departure from this, although it is about, I guess it is about being a freelance musician in a way, but it's a book called My Car Caught Fire and Exploded. And it is about all the crazy things that have happened to me as a working musician. And so this, whereas Road Warrior Without an Expense Account is kind of a sober look at the state of the profession, this other one is all the wacky things that happen to you as a musician. And so it's very different in tone, and I just hope people have a chuckle over that book. I'm having a blast with it. I'm actually mostly done with it. It's in the editing stage, and that's the stage that can take a long time. So, and then my last book that's still emerging. It's going to be about the world of bass, and it'll probably be called Contrabass Conversations, which is the name of the podcast that John and I have co-hosted. But it's not going to be just transcript. It's going to be kind of lessons learned from the greats in the world of bass. Not really transcriptions of interviews, because that's something you can already get. I mean, I already have all that out there. But I haven't really seen a book exactly like what I'm trying to do. But it'll be part method book, part reflection on interviews and advice that I've gotten from just all the major leaders on my instrument, the bass.
So if someone's out there and they're listening to this, how do they get your book? What's the best way to go about that?
Oh, just go to doublebassblog.org. There's a link to it right on the page, or go over to Amazon. Best place to get is just go to Amazon, search for Road Warrior Without an Expense Account. You'll find it right there.
Well, Jason, I'm looking forward to this State of the Orchestra podcast. So, we should, really interesting, getting a lot of, different people, from the different parts of this business that we're in, and even incorporating, we should do some live blogging with this too. You get some people to call in and just start getting a conversation going. Because if there really isn't a forum for this, I mean, as of now, if you think about it.
Yep. Nope. I think this is a great idea. So, yeah, thanks for chatting with me about it too. It's interesting to talk about the book. I always like talking about these topics. So.
All right, Jason. Well, it's been a pleasure today, and look forward to doing another project in the future.
Absolutely.
This is 2017 Jason again, and I love the juxtaposition of very sort of heroic movie music like finale music to what is kind of a bleak talk if you really think about it. So, yeah, fascinating to listen back to this kind of thing. One of the advantages of doing a podcast is you have all of this documented like this. It must be the same sort of feeling that people have been doing YouTube channels for a long time have when they go back and watch their like grungy early content from 2006, 2007. But it's an interesting topic, and I feel like I'm sort of at the nascent stages in this topic of really understanding musical entrepreneurship, which is a kind of a buzzword now. It's something I've talked about on the podcast a lot. If you type contrabassconversations.com/careers, I think it'll come up with those, because I didn't want to have to make everybody try to spell entrepreneurship. Careers will take you to all the episodes that we've done on the podcast covering this, and there've got to be at least 12 to 15 at this point. So that's something that's now being covered in great detail, because it's obviously a pain point. All these numbers I was quoting, people have begun to move, sometimes in directions to help with that. We've got people like Andrew Hitz comes to mind, Emilio Guarino comes to mind, Seth Haynes, another one that comes to mind, Jennifer Rosenfeld with iCadenza and Creative Careers. So people are talking about, I'm forgetting a ton of people, Claire Condit with The Marketed Musician. So people are addressing this. There are resources out there. And but at the same time, this lifestyle that I was describing here, that this Jason from 10 years ago was describing, there are a lot of people that are living that lifestyle. And I think the one thing, not the only thing, but one thing that I said in this talk really does still hit home. That's like, look at yourself and think truly about, are you enjoying this kind of work? And just know that there are many more options than what you might realize. And I could go on and on about this for hours. So I'm going to shut up. Shut up, Jason, and let you get back to your life. Maybe I'll do another episode or something on the blog, or I don't know, about the way I've discovered different multiple income streams and this and that, and how I've woven things together in different ways to create a career. So I've found a lot of solutions outside of this freelancing, teaching kind of paradigm. But there are a lot of people still living within that paradigm. Some people love it and it's great. Some people hate it and they're looking for something else and they're lost and they're stuck. And the good news is now there are a lot of resources to help out there. So contrabassconversations.com/careers will set you up with those resources. Thank you for listening to this bonus episode. If you want to hear more on this topic or more bonus episodes like this or whatever, reach out. Let me know. I'd love to hear from you. That's going to do it for another episode of Contrabass Conversations. We will see you again soon for more life on the low end of the spectrum.